Okay, well, folks, I am very pleased to be able to introduce to you Amy Dwyer. And Amy is our research archaeologist. She's a full-time staff member here at the historic Spanish Point campus. She has lived in Florida for a long time. I met Amy 2 or 3 years ago at a meeting of the Charlotte Harbor Anthropological Society, and she and I kept in touch over the years. She then came and worked with us as a volunteer, actually, helping us out quite a bit. Then she became an intern. I'm going to allow her to tell you a little bit about her studies, and then very shortly after the adoption of the historic Spanish Point campus by Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, we were able to bring Amy on full-time into the research archaeologist position, which is a position that we really didn't have here for a number of years. And it's so essential to the management and understanding and education about this site. So we are very pleased to have Amy with us this afternoon. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Amy Dwyer and let her tell you a little bit more about her background, and then she's going to share with us some really neat information that'll help us all understand what things were like here many, many years ago. All right. Amy, take it away.
Thank you, John. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I really appreciate you all being here this afternoon. I have met some of you, and I look forward to the opportunity to meeting the rest of you. Whenever you're on site, please come by and say hello, and let's chat about some archaeology and history. John, thank you for sharing all that information about how we met and how I ended up here at historic Spanish Point campus of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. As Sean mentioned, I went back to school later in life for a second degree. My first degree was in social sciences, and later in life, as my children grew up, I wanted to go back and study archaeology. That was something I had a passion for my whole life. So I was able to have the opportunity to go to Florida Gulf Coast University down in Fort Myers and study with the professors down there and earn a second degree in anthropology. And I was able to pursue my love of Florida archaeology. I've been given a lot of opportunities to go out in the field and work as a technician and gain a lot of experience. At the same time, I had the internship here, so I was learning about this site and getting to know our history here and meeting all of you. And during that process, I was able to collaborate with an archaeologist and a professor I knew from Florida Gulf Coast University, who was looking for a location for his students to conduct their field methods class. And that's a semester that they used to study learning all about working in the field, how to utilize the tools, how to study the stratigraphy, how to identify and properly label artifacts. So the timing was perfect. They were looking for a site, and we were looking at exploring the boundaries of the midden out onto the point past Point Cottage. So it was wonderful to get started right off with the collaboration and to be able to introduce the members and the visitors to this new part of our site and to be able to share that process with them. I am here every Thursday out at the point, still cleaning and processing some of those artifacts and sharing what we've been able to learn. So if you're here on a Thursday, please stop by and come down and see what I'm working on and ask questions and pick up some of the artifacts. And if you want to, you can even sit and help me out a little bit while you're there. So today, I wanted to talk to y'all a little bit about some of the time periods and the people within our region and what that meant for us at our site here at the historic Spanish Point campus. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in, and the title of this presentation is The Indigenous People of Central Gulf Coast, Florida, and the Peopling of the Palmer Site, 8SO2. I will explain a little bit more about what that title means. There's a lot in there. First of all, the indigenous people, I think we all kind of understand what that means. But we'll talk about what the Central Gulf Coast is and what the peopling of our region and the Palmer site has been. And then I'll tell you what 8SO2 is, just in case you're not familiar with that. So I wanted to go ahead and put a question out there for you, because I know every time I'm working on site or I'm walking around and I'm talking to our visitors and members and guests, I often get asked this question: who are the people that lived here? What was their name? Well, what do you call them? Everybody wants to be able to have a name to call that group, and then they have a lot of guesses. So I imagine if I'm getting this question, you're all getting this question a lot when you're out on site as well. So we'll address this question a little bit further into the presentation, but I kind of wanted to go ahead and just plant that seed so that you could kind of think about that a little bit while we're going through the topics of conversation. So we're going to talk about our region and the time periods. We're going to talk about what is the Gulf Coast region, this central Gulf Coast region that we're in, what the Palmer Site 8SO2 is, and then we're going to cover some of the time periods. And each time period could be an entire presentation, multiple presentations themselves. So we're going to just kind of do hit some points on each of those time periods and how they apply to our region and directly to our site. So we'll hit a little bit on the late Paleo-Indian period, and Little Salt Spring, which happens to be a very important site that's right here in Sarasota County. Then we're going to touch on the Archaic period, and in particular, the late Archaic period, which applies to our site. That is the beginning of our archaeological record here at Historic Spanish Point. And then we're going to move into the Woodland period, and that's where we start to break down groups into cultures. There's more populations, more people in the region, and they're now breaking off into their culture groups, and they're defined that way more than just according to what the period is. So here in particular, we're going to talk a little bit about the Minnesota culture and the Safety Harbor culture. So the Central Gulf Coast region, Florida Public Archaeology Network is divided into different regions within the state of Florida. We fall within the West Central region for them, and those counties include DeSoto, Hardy, Highlands, Hillsborough, Manatee, Pasco, Pinellas, Polk, and Sarasota. So we think of ourselves being coastal. However, those other counties are also a very important part of our region and the peopling of this area in our history. Milanich, in his book on Florida archaeology, states that Pasco County, south to Sarasota County through Pinellas, Hillsborough, Manatee counties, the inland, the region reaches nearly to the Peace River drainage in Polk, Hardy, and DeSoto counties. And when we start talking a little bit more about our periods, especially into the Archaic period, you'll understand how that those are important areas inland, just as much as our coastal sites are for the people that lived here. The map down at the bottom is from Milanich, and number 6 is the Central Peninsular Gulf Coast. And you can see that that's the area that encompasses all of the counties that we just mentioned. All right, so we're not going to go too far into depth on this, but it's in the title. So I wanted to touch on just a couple things before we keep moving along. So the Palmer Site 8SO2, some of you may see this written on a bag, or if you have some docent materials from the past that you've read through, or if you're just doing a little bit of research on your own on Historic Spanish Point and the Palmer Site. And it's called the Palmer Site or the Oaks Tract on the Florida Master Site file. So this goes back to the 1950s and 60s when the site was excavated, in particular when the Bullens were here. But when the site was first identified, it's given a number or an identification code of sorts. So ours is 8SO2, and the 8 is for the state of Florida, the S is for Sarasota County, and O2 is the number of this site identified in that county. This is a system that was developed by the Smithsonian. It's a trinomial system, and every state has a number. Hawaii and Alaska are out of the alphabetical order because this was in the 40s, and at that time Hawaii and Alaska were not in the 50 states. So Some counties, and you may have this question, there might be two counties with the same letter. So if it starts, say, can't think of one off the top of my head, but if trying to think of Sumter County, for example, we have Seminole County and Sumter County. So Seminole, I believe, is the first county that starts with an S. Well, no, Sarasota is, I'm sorry. So then Seminole County, so it would be SE, Sumter would be SU. So the second letter in the county would follow the first letter, and that's the identification. So we are historic Spanish Point, but according to the master site file, we are the Palmer site or the Oaks Tract 8S02. And the O2 is pretty special because that means that we were the second site identified in Sarasota County. Also, as we move along, you'll see that for the dating system, I use BCE or CE. BCE is before Common Era, also can be before Christian Era, and CE would be Common Era or Christian Era. So these are numerically equivalent to BC and AD. Which makes them simple to use. They are becoming a more accepted identifier to use BCE or CE because they're a little bit more neutral if we stick with common and not Christian. If you see BP and some of our old documents that we have and some of the docent guides that we had in the past will have BP. BP is associated with carbon dating, and it means before present. So carbon dating came about in the 1940s, late 1940s, and 1950 was a nice even round date to use as the present date. Where it gets a little bit confusing there is because that's before present. So when you see that, you need to subtract from 1950. So 3000 BCE would be 1050 BP. So if you use that, that's fine. And if you read it in any research that you do yourself or anything you come across here, or any books, you just want to kind of keep that in mind. Some people feel that we should stay with using before present. The difficulty with that is it would change every single year. So right now the present would be 2020. So that means yearly, all of the dates would change. So right now, for our purposes and for anything that you see me do out here, I'm going to stick with BCE and CE. All right, so the first period that we're going to jump into is the late Paleo-Indian period, and this is from 10,000 BCE to 7,500 BCE. And what's really, really amazing and awesome where we live here in Sarasota County is that we have Little Salt Spring. It's an archaeological site that is in the south part of Sarasota County, closer to Northport. And it's a really important archaeological site. In the discoveries that were made there, we know that this is one of the oldest sites in Florida and in the Southeast. So to tell you a little more about the background of this site and what was happening in this time period in Florida, our environment was dry. It was a cooler climate. Think more of savannas. The sea level was 160 feet lower than present. So Florida was much larger than it is now. It looked completely different. And the Gulf Coast, where we're here, was 40 to 70 miles further out than it is today. So people that were moving around during that time period were nomadic. They were looking for sources of food and water. And one model that applies to this time period is the Oasis model. And this is actually by Milanich. And it applies to the watering holes that we had at the time. And often the watering holes would be possibly a sinkhole in an area where there's a lot of karst. So a lot would occur in North Florida. But down here, we had a really special watering hole, and that was Little Salt Spring. And so At this spring, it would be a source of water, not just for humans, but it would also create more vegetation. So there was more plants and the animals were drawn to the watering holes. So the humans would follow the animals and they had sources of food and sources of water. They would travel in small groups of hunters and gatherers. And then they would travel to some former watering holes. There's sites located near river mouths and springs. So in Little Salt Spring that we have here, we have found artifacts, human remains, and those have been dated. And it has been found that that site, humans were there 12,000 years ago. So the technology that they had, that we have found some of the artifacts, or archaeologists have found artifacts, are wooden spears, wooden stone tools, and one of the wooden stakes that was found at Little Salt Spring is one of the oldest dated artifacts in southeastern America. And my last note down there was our subsistence. I told you that they were following the animals to the watering holes, and typically they would hunt small to medium animals. There were still large animals at the time, like you see in the picture there of that fun ground sloth. We did have those here in our region of Florida. So when we start moving away from the Paleo-Indian period, we start to come into the Archaic period, and what really defines that are the changes in the environment. The temperatures become warmer, there's more water because the glaciers are melting and the sea levels are rising. Areas that would maybe have water and then dry up, we're now staying wet. So we have some rivers or streams that are more full, which also meant that there was increased vegetation and resources. These conditions continue to change through the early and middle Archaic period, and by the late Archaic period, they're very much the same as we know them to be today. So the people that were living during the Archaic period, they were becoming semi-sedentary. So they weren't quite as nomadic as the Paleo-Indians. They were starting to settle a little bit more. And by the middle Archaic period of 4000 BCE to 300, or I'm sorry, 3000 BCE, people began to really start to settle more along these rivers and coastal sites because of the availability of water and the increased number of animals, because just as humans were starting to grow in population, so were the animals and so is the vegetation. They were seasonal at this time, so they still would follow their sources of food. So it could depend on the time of year for animals like deer or fish. Availability would be different and they would travel to where those food sources were. Technology during the Archaic period greatly increases. I have a quote there actually by my former professor and the archaeologist who worked out here: increased need for resources and the tools to access them. There's more people, there's more tasks because there's more that needs to be done to feed everybody and take care of your group. In early Archaic period, darts start to replace the large Paleo-Indian points that we think of. There's an increased variety in tools because they are making more hunting weapons and other things that they need to survive. And then using the secondary product from animals. So no longer are they just hunting animals and then processing the animals for food. They're also using the other parts of the animals, so that they are starting to use the bone, and they're using tendons because you can use tendons, for example, to attach the points to your spear. During this time, we also see the atlatl emerge, and some of you may know what an atlatl is, but if you don't, it's really similar to that fun toy that you may have for your dog called a chuck it, which looks like a stick and it holds a tennis ball, and you swing your arm back and throw it forward, and you can throw it much further than if you were just throwing it by hand. And this is what the atlatl did for the Native Americans. It gave them the ability to throw their spears much further than they used to be able to. So They could create more of an arc, the spears would travel faster and further, and it was safer because they didn't have to get as close to the animals. During the Middle Archaic, moving forward, we start to see more of these bone tools that they're crafting from the animals. Shell tools are starting to come into the toolbox. Shell mounds are starting to be built. And all of the tool types are increasing, including multi-purpose tools, tools that they could use for maybe cleaning and processing animals and for carving something out of wood. So during this time period, there's a lot of hunting and gathering going on, and there's a lot of shellfish in the diet, a variety of animals, and a variety of plants. So it's also during this later time period, well, more Middle Archaic time period, that we start to see mortuary practices come into play. So one example that I put on there is Wendover Pond. That's in Brevard County. So it is the other coast, but it's a good example of showing what people were doing and that they had ideology and practicing ceremonialism. That is a unique charnel pond. The bodies were well preserved when the site was accidentally uncovered, and they were actually able to recover human tissue and other artifacts that were wood artifacts, which wood doesn't normally preserve well in Florida unless it's in a peat environment and an anaerobic environment. And in this case, everything was very well preserved. So they could study how they had buried their dead and how they had covered them in fabric and even pinned them down so that they would stay below the water when the water might rise. So what was unique about that is that there are these charnel ponds around Florida, and it's easy to imagine that this was probably happening in other places during this archaic period throughout Florida. So let's kind of jump right to the end of the late Archaic period. That's 3000 BCE to 500 BCE. And what's really cool about this is when our archaeology record begins here at the historic Spanish Point campus. In particular, our archaic shell ring, which also may be referred to as the archaic shell midden, or the hill cottage midden. So you may see any of those terms come up in some of our documentation here. If you're reading through any of the books or other things that we may have. At this time, middens become extensive. The middens are large. They're becoming monumental architecture. They're built intentionally. In particular, ours is unique because it is shaped like a horseshoe. So this is the time period that we see some of these horseshoe or ring-shaped middens that are appearing along the coasts of Florida and up through Georgia and South Carolina. Ours is unique in that it's one of the largest, and it's the most dense with shell, and it's open to the public. And most are not open to the public and aren't really even accessible. So the environment for the people that were living here is much like what we have today. The only difference is when they first came, we would have had most likely freshwater springs going around the point, the easternmost point over closer to the Archaic Midden. And that was when they were coming right around their first appearance here, which was right at the end of the Middle Archaic, beginning of late Archaic. But for the most part, through the late Archaic, it would have looked like it did today, and it would have just been hot and humid and very much the same. The people were more sedentary, so larger populations in Northeast and Southwest Florida along our waterways and coast. More groups were appearing and settling and building villages and building these shell middens. The humans were really well adapted to the environment. They knew how to utilize their sources and how to move around, and they were familiar with where they were traveling to and from. During this time, we also see some ceremonialism. We had mentioned the burials before. There's also burials in the mounds and artifacts, food refuse, and possibly periods of feasting where we may find stratigraphy or lenses that have high concentrations of a particular shell or a concentration of pottery or artifacts of some sort. So the tool assemblage, shell tool assemblage is still increasing now. Technology is still advancing rapidly. In particular here, we find whelks and quahog were used quite a bit. As many of you know and are familiar with the whelks and the quahog both, they were used, the columella hammers, they were used as cutting tools, digging tools, scrapers, adzes, net gauges, chisels, axes, all sorts of tools. Pretty much what you'd see in your toolbox at home, but just made out of shells. There were ceramics that appeared here, and over to the right, you will see an image of a piece of fiber tempered pottery. This is some of the earliest pottery, and we have some here. It is not believed to have been manufactured here. However, it is indicative of trade. So we are seeing that we do have these social networks. There isn't much pottery because one, they weren't really producing it. And also they had all the shells, tools that they were using for what they needed. So as for subsistence, they were agrarian. They did not practice agriculture along the coastlines, and their diet consisted of the marine fish, shellfish, and then the other animals that they would hunt, the small mammals in particular, and then freshwater fish as well from their trips inland. So we have a tendency here to, we think of our archaic shell midden, and I don't want to say we have a tendency, but it's easy even for visitors when I'm talking to them. They think of the archaic shell midden and that's it. And then that was over and those people left. And then we have another midden over on the Shell Ridge and it's behind White Cotton. That's different. But really the time periods transition together and a lot of the activities that the people were doing were the same. And it doesn't mean that they just quit using one side of the site. It just means that there was a transition happening. Some of the artifacts that may be found in the Shell Ridge midden may also be found over on the archaic midden as well. So there were some changes happening as we start to come out of this archaic period, and a lot of it has to do with population growth and sedentism. So we kind of start to move into this woodland period out of the archaic period. There's increased sedentism. People aren't, they're building villages, they're staying, there's still some seasonality, but for the most part, they're establishing themselves. So along with that becomes more complex societies. We begin to start to see culture adaptations, religion, economy-based cultures, subsistence strategies. Here in particular, it would be fishing strategies for sure, leadership, and then craft specialization. And with that, that is individuals within a cultural group who may be tool makers or they may have been pottery makers and they add their own stylistic qualities to that. That's why we see that maybe some pottery in some places is more decorated than other places. And often it's the person that's making it. So technology just becomes more diverse and stylistic, as we just mentioned. New pottery styles mean that there's new ceramic toolkits because now some cultures in our region are starting to use tools with their pottery. So they're incising them, they're punctating them, they're giving them their own special touch. So subsistence, there's increased population, there's more people to feed. That means that there's more food gathering, and oftentimes that will be a contributing factor to the leadership and what their economy is based on as well. So during this time period, the woodland period, which applies to the Southeast, and it does apply directly to this transitional period, it shared cultural traits across the region is a quote that I really like because that's really what we start to see. People are more, there's more people, they're more social, the trade networks are expanding. So people are finding their own identity and they're finding their similarities. So villages throughout the region, throughout our West Gulf Coast region, there was different villages. And we know that there was intermarriage and a lot of social interaction and trade going on. So in the woodland period in Florida, we start to break into some cultural periods. And I put in quote or parentheses, Perico, Deptford, Weedon Island. These are some that you're probably all familiar with, in particular Weedon Island, because they have some beautiful pottery and some ceramics, and Weedon Island expanded uh, a large area of Florida. And then I have Tocobaga to the north, and I have the Calusa to the south of us. Those are also other groups that you are all familiar with. And these are all groups that, kind of going back to that question for a minute of who were these people, oftentimes people in discussion will mention these groups because they are familiar with them. And then they want to associate the people that were here with those groups. So over to the right, I just threw a few photos on there, just the shuttles and the net making tools, because in a fishing economy, there would have been a lot of net making. There would have been individuals who were specialized in doing that. At the bottom, there's a picture of some ceremonialism going on, and you can see that there's a lot of people. And you can also see in the background that there's like a village. So they had, one area where maybe they were doing ceremony, and they had one area where they may have been living, and there may have been another area where they were processing food and making pottery and making jewelry, tools, that sort of thing. And then over to the right is actually a artifact that we had found on site, and it's a beautiful Buzikhan hammer. So I wanted to throw that on there. And just so y'all know, I think most of you know that the two holes on the side are where, and there is another hole actually that's beautifully cut. So it looked like they could actually put a stick through there in several different ways. But the top hole is the kill hole. So that's the hole where they originally broke open the shell and removed the food. You can't really see it that well on there, but the bottom of that is really nice and flat. It kind of looks like a chisel. So here during the woodland period, we define the culture that was here as part of the Minnesota culture. So Minnesota is a combination of Manatee and Sarasota. I'm sorry, it says Minnesota and Sarasota. It's Manatee and Sarasota. And this was a classification that was created by George Luer and Marion Almy, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with their names. They've done a lot of research over here and are very well known Florida archaeologists. And they started to look in particular at our cultural group here by looking at the artifacts and the style and the day-to-day lives of the people that were here. They began to determine that some of the sites in this area were different and were not part of Perico or Deptford or another cultural group, that they were their own culture group. And the way that they defined this was a few different classifications. One of those was the pottery. The culture that was here had mostly utilitarian pottery. It was sand-tempered plain. That's what they were manufacturing here. They weren't manufacturing decorated pottery or anything incised. Some of that that's found here was most likely coming from trade and social networks. This was also an economy that was based on fishing, hunting, and shell gathering. That was kind of their thing. That's what they did. So they utilized the coastline. At this time, they're building middens parallel to the coastlines. So they would have had a village and their midden there. And then they would have also been utilizing the barrier islands that were in the same area, which takes us to the next characteristic of this Minnesota culture is they had village sites on the coast, and then they would have village sites inland. So they were still seasonally not moving back and forth per se, but traveling to those areas during certain times of the year, whether it was for food gathering or for trade. So During this time period, we see reuse and continued use of mounds. And in those mounds, we're finding still primarily the shell tools and the bone tools. And then we start to see some changes in the burial practices and the pottery about halfway through this Minnesota culture. Some of the burials start to reflect more of what we had seen the Weeden Island period, meaning that there may have been secondary burials, bundle burials, that sort of practice. And the pottery began to change around 400. It started to become thinner, and the lips of the pottery started to become more rounded. So there were some stylistic changes going on. So at the end of the Minnesota culture, we start to go into the safety harbor culture. And this is another term that you'll hear, another culture period that you'll hear a lot about in our region of Florida here. It was after 900 CE. And as most of you know, our site was abandoned by the people that were here during that period by around 1,000. Up until then, and I kept this slide kind of short and brief because it was a short period, but we did have the safety harbor influence, and we can find that in the material record. Safety harbor culture was growing at that time. It was encompassing most of the West Central Gulf Coast. The lifeways were similar, the practices were the same, populations were just growing, and there was probably more intermarriage and more crossover between the groups of people that were here. So most of that was utilitarian property, some decorated. Once you get into the safety harbor culture, I put a picture, image number 14 is called grog. And that pottery consists of temper from old broken pieces of pottery or clay that's already been fired. So it kind of has that little chunky look in the middle of it. At first sight, it can often look a lot like just the regular sand tempered plane, which is on the right. But it's just a different form of property that or pottery that we have found here on our site that is reflective of the safety harbor culture. All right, so that was a lot of time periods and a lot of information. So we're going to wrap some of this up here. Who were the people? So really quickly, we kind of identified what 8SO2 was. One thing that really makes it neat about being a site that was discovered early is that researchers and archaeologists and conchologists and all sorts of scientists have been able to gather a lot of information from our site. It's a well-preserved site. The Webbs knew what was here, and Bertha Palmer knew what was here, and they all took care of the site. It wasn't destroyed to fill roads. It wasn't looted. It was taken care of. So this really gave researchers an opportunity to learn a lot about this Central Gulf Coast region, and they can take what they learn and they can connect it across the region and across the state and across the Southeast. So with that said, you know, I think it's important to remember the temporality over 4,000 years that this site, and not only the 4,000 years, but even going all the way back to the Paleo Indians that were here right in our region, is that people have been connected through time. We put time periods in these nice little packaged titles of, you know, archaic, middle archaic, and we put cutoffs, but it's important to remember that there was transitions through those times and that people were still here. They were just changing, adapting to their environment, growing in numbers, and they were all connected. And although people left here when they did, and we don't know why, but they didn't just all go away. We have to realize that people are still connected, and right here today in Florida, we still have descendants of the people that have been here for 12,000 years or maybe even longer. So back to our, who are the people that lived here? What was their name? What do you call them? And I hear it all the time. And, you know, I think that, you know, we can answer with the culture periods and maybe try to explain and help educate the public on what the culture periods were and what their day-to-day lives were like. And oftentimes people will say to me, oh, well, they have to be Calusa because the Calusa were right there. And, you know, that's the only thing that makes sense. And I think what happens is people want to identify with a culture group. We do it today. You know, we love to say, oh, no, I make my great recipe because my grandma was Italian and I'm Italian and I make this recipe, or I'm a Floridian. I mean, you can drive down the interstate and see Flow Grown sticker on a car because somebody wants to say, I'm a Floridian. So we love to associate with groups, not only from our own ancestry, maybe our connections in our family or with our friends, but just in almost everything we do. If you play tennis, for example, oftentimes maybe one group of people will form their own tennis group and they have their name and they want to go by that name. So and I'm just using that as an example. It happens in all sports or all clubs. We just like to identify. So we have a tendency to want to project that onto the past and assume that they had to have a name that they called themselves. But we don't even know if they had a name that they called themselves. They could have had a totem or a symbol. It could have been an alligator or a bear, and that may have just been it. And they may have had a word for that or not. We don't know. So it's not fair really to try to put a name on them or to try to throw them into another group that they weren't a part of because they had their own practice and their own culture. There were neighbors on Casey Key. We don't know if that was the same group of people. They probably shared the same type of economy. They may have been associated, may not. It could have just been like a different neighborhood, you know, where you live in one neighborhood and somebody lives in a different neighborhood. You both like the same area, but you don't have, you have maybe even have different lineages. So when people ask this question, who are the people, what were their name, what do you call them? I typically say that, you know, the archaic people lived here, and I might talk about what they did, what their day-to-day lives were like and how they had adapted to the environment. And then I'll move into the Minnesota culture. And that's usually my answer. I'm sure each of you can kind of come up with your own narrative, but I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of information about our growing population from an archaeological record in this area of Florida, and maybe some ideas on how you can answer that question. So there's my works cited in my photo credits. And I want to, oh, I can see everybody now. I want to open it up if anybody has any questions about, I know that was a lot of information I threw at you. So I want to give you the opportunity to ask any questions, and or if you're thinking about it, y'all know where to find me on Thursday. You can call me.
Amy, I do see we had one question that came in via the chat. That was, what was the first site that was identified in Sarasota County?
The first site was in Inglewood. It is the Inglewood Mound.
Wonderful. And Mason and Dalton would like to know what time period the people who lived here left the site.
The people that left this site left around 1,000. So that would have been late woodland period, the end of the Minnesota into Safety Harbor period. So we were starting to kind of become Safety Harbor culture, which was kind of encompassing our whole West Central region. And those, that time, those culture groups within the region were starting to grow. They weren't here at this site. We don't know why they left, but we do know that those groups were starting to grow to the north and the south of us and within the Safety Harbor culture area and the Gulf Coast region, and they were here until European contact.
Does anybody else have any questions for Amy? You can put them in the chat, or if you're sharing your screen, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Barbara,
is that a question? See if we can get Barbara unmuted here.
I see a question on the chat from Brian related to Little Salt Spring. He's asking if there are any tours of that. There are occasionally very special tours of Little Salt Spring that are offered by Steve Koski, who is under contract with University of Miami. They're very few and far between. I think if there were a group of us, volunteers and team from Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, and we'd like to maybe do a little field trip as we work our way through COVID and we get more comfortable with that sort of thing, I think Steve would probably be happy to take us on a little field trip down there, which I think would be great.
Thank you, John. And Barbara, if you had a question, you are unmuted now, so you can go ahead and fire away.
I didn't know I was muted. I guess you get muted so you don't interrupt. I didn't know. I was just curious, and this is moving off site somewhat, but at the mention of Casey Key, I'm wondering, is there anyone there doing work or research, investigating archaeologically, or is that a place that we would eventually expand to see, you know, if they were neighbors, or if there was another group of people there totally separate?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good question. When Ripley and Adelaide Bullen came here and were working on their excavations in 1959, 1960, and 1962, they did go over to Casey Key because they were asking the question, were the two connected between our site and their site since we're so close? What they found is that the mounds that are over on Casey Key were very badly damaged. And this was back in the 50s when they found that, and that there had been extensive looting in the 20s. Can you hear me okay? There had been extensive looting in the 20s. They had thought that maybe that would be something in the future someone would investigate. John, you may have a little bit to add to that.
Yeah, on the north end of Casey Key, there was also a very large mound that shows up in a map that was drawn by some of the scientists from the Smithsonian that were down here in the responding to John Webb's discoveries in the 1870s. And so there was a very large mound there that I believe was destroyed by the 1921 hurricane, which basically created Midnight Pass where that mound used to be. Amy made reference to an extensive burial complex that was there. And unfortunately, that was well known in the community. And even back in the 50s, they described how there were skulls and bones from that site that were in people's homes and collections all over Sarasota. The Boy Scouts would go out there and collect them all and bring them all home, which nowadays is very, very much frowned upon and illegal, and bad mojo and all that stuff. If we were to wind our way further south on Casey Key, in some of the less bulldozed lots, there is a high probability of finding some small areas of shell mound or shell midden where there were seasonal campsites on the Barrier Island. There are more of those actually on Manasota Key, simply because Manasota Key has escaped, or for a number of years was escaping, the type of development that kind of clear cut the lots. And so I did a program, for instance, down at the Hermitage one night, and a woman walks up to me afterwards and says, I think I've got a mound in my yard. Do you want to come and take a look at it? And we walked across the street, and, you know, I found like 10 pieces of pottery and 2 shell tools in like 5 minutes flat. And she was just blown away because when they had put their driveway in, they kind of cut around the edge of this mound and they had exposed it. And so it was all just sitting there. But there are a number of sites on Manasota Key. What's fascinating is the different shells that were consumed at these different sites. And so they were probably very seasonally occupied. And so some of them have a lot of crown conch and some of them have a lot of scallop. And so they're much more temporary sites than the sites that Amy has described here at Historic Spanish Point. And then, you know, some of you might recall just in the last couple of years the discovery of the cemetery site submerged offshore Manasota Key, which is from the earlier Archaic period, and which was used as a burial site, we now know, from 7,000 to 8,000 years before today. So that goes back even further than historic Spanish Point. And I don't know if Amy mentioned or not, because I got pulled away from the program at one point, but if we were to do additional, very careful excavation in our archaic shell ring, we may find that its origins are much earlier than we currently think as well. Because when the Bullens did their research in the late 50s, early 60s, they stopped at the water line and they didn't go down below. And so there are some opportunities there. I see a question about DNA studies done on archaic burials. The challenge with DNA and burials is that you have to destroy the material to do the DNA analysis. And although that with technology is becoming a smaller amount of material, you really don't need to use the human remains to do that. You can do analyses of other materials. Now, if you're specifically talking about DNA of the bones themselves to find out, like the ancestry of folks, that is a little bit of a controversial subject, and not something that we would be inclined to do. I think that that's something that, if the native tribes, for instance, if the Seminole tribe of Florida wanted to do that kind of research and they made the decision to sacrifice the human remains to do that kind of research, I think that would be up to them. But that's not something that you're going to see us doing. What I would really like to work with Amy and some of the other archaeologists who are very knowledgeable is to kind of get to the bottom of the archaic shell ring and find out how old actually are we. And then also there are rumors that there's a submerged site in the bay, not far from our property. That would be worth investigating. And then there's some additional work that could be done on other sites that are in Little Sarasota Bay that are not protected in the same way this site is, but that are also part of the whole regional complex. And because I know many of you are volunteers at downtown campus, next time you're there, just look to the north where the first condominium tower is. That was a 20-foot tall pyramid-shaped mound that you're going to hear a little bit more about that on March 5th. That was one of the most prominent mounds in Sarasota, and that is why Mound Street is called Mound Street. And then there was a little midden that ran all the way down pretty much to Main Street, much of which was still there when I was growing up here in Sarasota, but now it's just one by one by one by one. The lots have become condominiums and it no longer exists. So back in the day, these sites existed all over. Now we're left with the remnants of the sites that, as Amy wisely said, the Webb family that lived here appreciated the Native American remains and actually helped the Smithsonian study them. Mrs. Palmer appreciated them and, created her gardens instead of bulldozing them. And then her grandson, Gordon Palmer, is who brought Ripley and Adelaide Bullen down to actually do the work that served as the greatest body of archaeological research that's taken place on the site. So someone was, just responding to my suggestion about the tour of Little Salt Spring. I think what we'll do is Amy and I'll reach out to Steve Koski and ask him if that's an option and how many people we could bring. And then maybe that's something that we could do in the fall, put it on the calendar and ask Steve to give us a little tour of Little Salt Spring. It's a very natural site, and so very different than War Mineral Springs, which is a spa and a park. Little Salt, you actually feel like you're going back in time. And Steve Koski, who is the county's archaeologist, has experience at War Mineral, Little Salt, Spanish Point, many other sites throughout this part of Florida. And he and Amy work together, and we have other archaeologists as well that Amy has reached out to because they have a history of doing work here on the property. So do we have any other questions for Amy or anything about any of what we talked about?
I was just going to say that a few years ago, Steve Koski gave a fascinating program with, slides that and apparently he does it all the time or has this all set up, but it would be very easy to squeeze him into one of our programs before we go out there. But it was just fascinating with all the layers of sediment and all of the ridges and ledges, I guess, that are inside of this body of water. And it was just fascinating. He gave a program and I know that a number of us went to it, and it was really, really, really interesting. And since it's a canned program, it might fit in well before we go out there as a good introduction.
Well, Peg, I think that's a great idea. I mean, if he did a Zoom with us, you know, a week before we go out to the site, then, you know, when we get there, we're able to kind of absorb and appreciate the site, and not have to get into all the detail that's better done with the slides. That's a great idea. So I think that's a great opportunity.
Pat,
Any
did you
other
have a question?
questions?
This isn't a question so much as a comment or observance. I am a docent at Guptill House, and when I start the spiel on the webs coming there, a lot of people, mostly people who have come from other states or other countries, who have read a little bit about Spanish Point, they will question me about the names. They want the names of the natives who were here before the webs. And they, of course, know the name Seminole. They know
Right.
Calusa. And I've been questioned many times,
Right.
who was here before the Calusas? And, you know, from
Right.
today, I can't give them a name. You
Well,
know,
no,
Right.
but it goes back to what Amy was saying, and that is that we have this modern, maybe modern artificial construct that we think that they had a tribal name.
exactly.
You know, and had the Europeans been more careful when they first came, and had they not essentially wiped out the population of Floridians, you know, probably 90%, with common cold, flu, chickenpox, measles, coronavirus, and all that stuff that knocked out the population, they might have taken the time to ask, who are you? What is your culture like? Who do you worship? You know, and all these things. But those conversations really didn't take place. And so the names like Calusa is a snapshot in time. You know, Ponce de Leon arrives, and the people at the time, and was Calusa what they called themselves, or was Calusa what the Europeans called them? Did the Europeans think that that's what they heard them say, and so they called them the Calusa? So the Seminoles is certainly not a name selected by the Native Americans. The Seminoles was a name that was imposed by the federal government to take all these indigenous people that had kind of, some that had survived in Florida, some that had fled to Florida, and label them in such a way to say, these are savages that must be removed to allow for the pioneering settlement of Florida. And so while people are looking for those tribal names, I think it's more important that we counter that and we say, well, you know, these people were here so long ago that their culture was not investigated or preserved by any of the European discoverers. And so therefore we will never know what they called themselves. But what we do know is that they were highly intelligent. They were very adaptable. They were living a very sustainable life. They were here for thousands of years, and that they lived off the land and lived with the land, and that they left clues to their existence behind, but no written language, which doesn't guarantee that they didn't have any. So for instance, someone said to me the other day, but John, they couldn't have been smart. They didn't written language. I said, how'd you know they didn't write on tree bark that rotted a long time ago? And then you hold up a flash drive and you say, what's going to happen when someone finds a flash drive 5,000 years from now? They're not going to know what to do with that. They're going to say that we didn't have any kind of language. We didn't write anything down, and so we weren't that intelligent. But one of the things I always like to say in my programs is that these people living here, even 10, 12,000 years ago, their brain size was exactly the same as ours. There has not been a change in the brain size in that period of time. These were very creative, very adaptable, very smart people who eked out an existence in a fairly hostile situation, although they did have, by rights, plenty to eat. So you could call them the mound builders. You could call them Florida's first peoples. You can call them Florida's indigenous peoples. But I think we have to try to not be embarrassed by people who want to embarrass us by challenging us to say, what did they call themselves? Because you go back to a 5,000-year-old settlement there, or occupation around the archaic shell ring, there's no way you're ever going to know what those people called themselves. And you can't suppose that 1,000 years before the Ponce de Leon arrived, that the people in Charlotte Harbor were calling themselves the Calusa. I doubt that very seriously, you know, but it's a mystery. And isn't the mystery part of what's interesting about the history? I think it is. I have a program I'm getting ready to do that's going to be everything that we don't know about something, because sometimes that's as interesting as what we do know. And then to kind of have to confess that, isn't it a shame that there wasn't a greater effort made on the part of the people from the old world who were the sophisticated, smart people, came here, and instead of wanting to learn from the people that were here, kind of branded them as savages to be converted and left it at that, So who was, and what were those Europeans called that came here? What were they called? So they were named after, right? They were Portuguese, they were Spanish, they were named for the countries that they came from. Well, the people here were from here. They were the first Floridians. So I say, tell them they were the first Floridians. That's what they were.
I think we have time for one more question. Mimi has her hand up. Go ahead and unmute Miss Mimi.
I was going to say, I'm from Colorado, and most of the Colorado Indian tribes, when you translate their name into English, it turns out to be the people.
There you go.
Nice.
How much sense does that make? And think about the inclusive aspect of that. The people. We're just the people. We're not categories of people. Right? Fascinating.
Mimi, I really love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is really fascinating.
I think Amy did a great job, and I'd like to commend her for stepping up to do it and share some of her knowledge. But Amy is awesome, and come down on the Thursdays when she's out doing her, she's working here all the time, but she's doing the public archaeology on Thursdays. And then we also have a little program that we do like on the third Wednesday of the month, little special program that's been well attended by small groups. And but if any of the volunteers from downtown campus, you want to come down and connect with Amy, you can find her email. Caitlin can connect you to her. She'd be more than happy to show you around this place and get you oriented so you can learn more about it, so that you can share that with others that you might encounter both downtown and here at Spanish Point, and in your travels with neighbors and stuff like that too.
And on that same topic, I will say that we are here at the historic Spanish Point campus putting together an archaeological docent team. And we're going to try to get that going in March. And so keep an eye out. Next Friday, March 5th, you should receive the next volunteer newsletter. And there's more information in there about how you can get involved if you would like to work closely with Amy and learn more about the archaeological history of historic Spanish Point and help us share that with the public. So I think that'll be a fun assignment, and I hope some of you will join us for that. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Amy, for a wonderful job sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you for all coming and joining today and listening. And I look forward to talking to you all more soon.